This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the very niche and kind of geeky details of modern warfare with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to Giancarlo Fiorella. He's doing a PhD and he also runs a website called In Venezuela Blog, where he gives people up-to-date information on the situation in Venezuela in English every single day. Giancarlo is going to be telling us about the small-scale rebellion that started last year in Venezuela and has been crushed this year by the regime there. He's also going to be talking about the deteriorating situation in the country. To keep us going, to support Popular Front, go to patreon.com/popularfront. This episode is sponsored by thedefensepost.com. 2017, perhaps not the start, the start of the riots, the start of the protests when they were really heating up and started hitting the news in the West, or at least in the Western media. Why did those riots start, and I guess where did they come from?
Yeah, so the unrest that we saw last year, starting in April, started as a result of two decisions from the Supreme Court that came in late March. And that's part of another sort of backstory to the Venezuelan crisis. But what the Supreme Court ruled in March was that they were taking over all of the powers of the National Assembly, which is controlled by the opposition. So the Supreme Court came in March and said, the National Assembly is in contempt of the law, and we are going to take over all of their powers. So we are going to be the legislative branch of government. And by the way, we are the ones who decide when the National Assembly is not in contempt anymore. So because the Supreme Court is controlled by the regime, the opposition said, well, this is it. Like, we're done politically. If the National Assembly loses power, then this is a dictatorship, etc. And so they called for protests to react to that ruling. What happened, though, was that the protests were really fueled not only by that decision, which was eventually, if I remember correctly, walked back, but it was fueled by the crisis in general. So the shortage of food and medicine and basic necessities, the hyperinflation that was beginning in that time. Basically, every grievance that people had with the Maduro regime sort of got sucked up into this constitutional sort of government crisis, and it fueled the protests until August of last year.
Okay, so maybe let's back up even more then. Why was there such a shortage of food? Why has all this stuff been happening under Maduro?
The shortages of food and medicine and basic necessities are really stem from a couple of issues. One of them is that really dating back to the Chavezs years, Venezuela has lost what ability it had to feed itself. So things like, the ability to produce food, in farms or et cetera. Like internal production of food has really collapsed.
Why, though?
So going back to Chavez again, one of the things that Chavez did was he expropriated land sort of on a mass scale, as well as private industry. So you had companies that were producing food, you had farms that were producing food. And Chavez, because of sort of the nature of the Bolivarian Revolution, the fact that private industry has been vilified really going on for 20 years now in Venezuela, would expropriate private businesses, private farmland that he considered to be, for whatever reason, not helping or not helping the cause of the Bolivarian Revolution. What was expropriated was mismanaged by the government. Sort of entire companies would be kind of looted dry by whichever kind of lackey was put in charge of them. And because there was so little accountability, you had just droves and droves and droves of land not producing food, and you had the same thing happening to private companies. So whereas you had a company that was importing food at some point, or processing food that was produced in Venezuela, it was put under government control, and over the years it just sort of ceased to operate. That's one factor. The other one is that Venezuela imports a lot of its food and medicine, in fact most of it. And as the country's financial accounts have taken a dive, this is particularly the case since Maduro, it's lost the ability to do that. It's lost the ability to buy enough food and enough medicine and enough basic necessities from abroad in order to feed and to keep hospitals stocked. And so that began, there was the food scarcity. I remember being noticeable even back in 2008. I was much younger back then, but I remember going to supermarkets in Venezuela and noticing that, the shelves were empty and people were kind of complaining about the lack of food. But that really took off once Maduro came into power.
So you remember that as a kid, right? Because, you grew up in Venezuela, right?
Yeah. So I left in 1997, but I'd gone back, there was a period of time when I was going back every year, every 2 years. So I do remember scarcity being a thing even back then. But it's funny, as much as a lot of people didn't like Chavezs, when he was alive, and he got all kinds of flack from people from what we call the opposition in Venezuela. A lot of people, I think, look back on his tenure now kind of fondly, because they said, as bad as things might have been, they were much better than they are today, especially in terms of the scarcity of food and medicine. Which, as I said, really sort of took off once Maduro came into power.
There will be a lot of people who listen to this, kind of communists, or, what I call tankies, the hard left that are so hard left, they're basically touching the far right, you know what I mean? Those kind of people, I've seen them saying, ironically, it's mostly white people who've never even been to Venezuela, and most of them are rich kids, but they're saying, no, it's not true, it wasn't Chavez's fault, it's not Maduro's fault about the food shortage, it's all because of the West and sanctions, and there have been sanctions. There's got to be some truth to that, or what do you think?
Yeah, so, I would say a couple, I do run into a lot of those people online, and I'll say a couple of things to that. The first is that, there are sanctions in place. The sanctions originally started to target regime officials. So I'm talking about the sanctions that have been put in place by the European Union and Canada and the United States. And so when you say sanctions, you're talking about sanctions against named individuals. And, there's less than 100 of them, I think, in the U.S. list, which is the most expansive one as far as I can remember. And so those sanctions would say, okay, Maduro cannot come into the United States, or if he has any assets in the country, any money in banks, any real estate, we're going to seize that. And also, we're banning any U.S. entity from conducting business with him. So there's a bunch of regime officials who are under those sanctions. There are also sanctions that came in, I believe, in August of last year from the United States, banning the purchase and any transactions with certain government bonds. So those are more kind of hard-hitting financial sanctions. So those target the regime's ability to finance itself. But those came in August of last year. And by August of last year, the crisis was well underway.
Right.
And so, to blame the sanctions for the way that the country is today is to completely ignore the fact that it was in a really, really, really bad shape well before the sanctions came in. The one that's always sort of hanging over the country's head are oil sanctions. So there's always rumors that the U.S. in particular is going to, stop buying oil from Venezuela or something. Those haven't been put into place. Those would be completely, devastating to the country. And so I think that's one of the reasons why they haven't been implemented. And the other thing I would say is that I don't know why people continue to defend the government. I mean, I guess people don't like to be wrong. They don't like to feel like they're wrong about something. But, there are all kinds of people in Venezuela who supported Chavez. There are high-ranking members of his government who have stepped aside and said, you know what, this Maduro guy is not what we were about. Whatever Chavez's vision was for Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution, that is not what's happening in the country right now. I'm thinking of people like Rafael Ramirez, who was one of Chavez's closest allies. He was the head of the oil company, PDVSA, for like 10 years. The former Attorney General, Luis Ortega Diaz, she's also, she's in exile right now because she started speaking out against the government. And so there, the support for Maduro is sort of really low in Venezuela in general, and that includes people who once supported Chavez and were members of his government.
I think what it comes down to is you get kind of, like Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton, they're complete lunatics. Nobody really seriously takes them serious, I mean, Max Blumenthal is a millionaire because of his dad. And I think for him, politics is just an adventure playground. They kind of pick a side and then they start calling people this, that, and the other. They don't actually really know what's going on. So I think what it is for them, they're just playing into part of the spectacle. They're not actually knowing what it's like. And like you said, if people are actually stepping down who were Chavez people, even they're saying, no, this is not right. And then you got this guy in DC or New York or Brooklyn, whatever, is saying, well, actually, no, it's some kind of fascist takeover from the US. It's obviously nonsense. But forget them. Let's go on to talk about the riots, like how did they really start? Because I remember keeping a close eye on it. And it just kind of exploded, it was a few barricades here and there, rock throwing, and then all of a sudden, it really ramped up.
Yeah, so that's what I was sort of trying to get at earlier. So what happened was, so there was these two rulings from the Supreme Court. The opposition said, we can't stand for this. We need everybody to go out and protest against these rulings. And I think the date that they picked was April 1st, I think was the date that they said, okay, let's all go out on the streets and we're going to protest against this. So people took that, so they sort of took that to the extreme and said, okay, yes, we're going to come out on April 1st, and we're not going to leave until the government changes, until Maduro is out, right? And so they did seem to sort of explode onto the media scene quite suddenly because, that is how it happened. As I said, the rulings came out in late March. I think it was within a week that the opposition said, of the rulings coming out, that they said, let's start the protest. But what really sustained them throughout, April, May, June, July, was the more general discontent against the government. So you had daily massive protests, some of the largest protests that the country had ever seen, taking place on a daily basis, in particularly in Caracas. Again, fueled by this desire to see the government change, to see Maduro leave.
Right, and who were doing the protests, because there was some, again, we have to mention it because the maniacs do kind of take over quite a lot of space when it comes to the discussion on this, but there were some people saying these aren't, popular protests, these are kind of US-backed fascists, ultra-nationalists. I certainly kept a good eye on what was going on there and definitely did not see that. It seemed to me to be a lot of young men going, fuck this, we're not having it anymore. You know what I mean? What do you think?
Yeah, certainly the people on the front lines of the protests, we call them escuderos in Venezuela. It's a term that I think came out during the protest movement. Were young people, sort of college kids who were saying things like, I don't have a future in this country and I want to have a future here. I don't want to have to leave. So they're the guys that you would see with shields, homemade shields, fighting National Guard soldiers and National Bolivarian police for the most part at protests. The thing that I always say is that what makes the crisis, and I'm talking about the scarcity of food and medicine and basic necessities, that hits the poorest of the poor the hardest, right? It's the most marginalized sectors of society who feel that the most, because if you are rich, you have the ability to find food better than somebody who isn't rich, right? And so, to say that the protests were, like a minority movement, or that they were sort of manned entirely by like CIA bots or whatever it is that people say, it completely ignores the reality on the ground. You had, tens of thousands of people protesting on a daily basis all throughout the country.
Right, and these protests eventually turn into clashes. Maybe you can tell us about that. How did that kind of evolve into, it was a small-scale conflict at one point in the streets, right?
Yeah, so the Maduro regime's response to protests is typically sort of like open, brutal repression. What happens even during protests that are peaceful, and I would say that the majority of them, at least last year, is that the National Guard will show up, or the National Bolivarian Police, and they'll start shooting tear gas at people. They'll start hosing them down with the high-pressure water cannon trucks. and they'll shoot them, the protesters, with rubber pellets. So that began immediately. Anytime you have a big protest, that's sort of what happens right away. You would then have protesters, some of them fighting back, typically the younger ones in the groups would throw rocks or Molotov cocktails at the police. And then you also had what's sort of like the looming danger in all protests in Venezuela, the Colectivos Armados, which in English means armed groups or armed collectives. And these are groups of civilians who Amnesty International calls them pro-government civilian armed groups.
Like paramilitaries, right? Like Maduro paramilitaries.
Yeah, so they're sort of similar to what you see in we saw in Nicaragua earlier this year. They're pro-government. I mean, I think that's a pretty good description of them, pro-government civilian armed groups. And they'll show up at protests, and they'll do things that typically the police would get in trouble for doing, just like kind of, shooting into crowds and all that. And that's when you saw some of the more sort of like the uglier conflicts happening. So if you ever saw a video of like a firefight happening in Venezuela, or just like people shooting into crowds, those most likely involved Colectivos Armados.
And these people started, I've seen videos, we've all seen them. They just started firing into crowds. They started shooting unarmed protesters as well. In fact, there's even footage of them shooting buckshot at a reporter from Sky News, I think it was. They were really starting to kind of dig in.
Yeah, the National Guard, yes, I've seen, they've killed people with what's supposed to be less lethal ammunition, right? Things like rubber pellets, which, evidently will kill you if you shoot them sort of at point blank ranges, which is what often happens. The National Guard will usually, whoever does that, if it's caught on tape, could get in trouble with the police, just because it looks really bad for the regime. I think this was certainly the case last year. I'm not entirely sure that it's the case now. The regime was very much concerned, I think, with maintaining a certain image, especially for the international media, I think, in order to maintain support from the sorts of people that you were talking about earlier. And so if a National Guard soldier were to shoot someone at point blank and kill them, and that was captured on video, chances were that soldier might get in a little bit of trouble. I know that some soldiers were arrested following, allegations that they were the ones responsible for killing protesters. The thing about Colectivos is that that they're not sort of bound to that institutional pressure to keep up the face that Venezuela is a democracy and that we prosecute people who abuse human rights, right? And so that's why they play I think a really important role in the government's repression repertoire. They're a tool that can come out and do a lot of the sort of the dirty work that the National Guard does sometimes, but maybe is a little bit afraid to actually do.
And how closely do you think they were working with the police and the National Guard? The Collectivos certainly at some points looked like they were just kind of, local neighborhood guys that were for Maduro. And then other times they look like these guys are working hand in hand with the police.
Yeah, the reason for that is that is what they are. Like with so many things in the media, the term colectivo sort of makes you think that there is one thing that is a colectivo armado. But in fact, there's a whole spectrum of organizations and interests and formations that are called colectivos armados. So you do have groups of concerned neighbors who, maybe aren't super into Maduro, but they appreciate the gains that Chavezs made for them, and they want to protect that idea of the Bolivarian Revolution, and they don't want an opposition protest in their neighborhood, so they'll show up at a protest as counter-protesters, and somebody will take a picture of them, and they are called a colectivo armado. You also have, on the other side of the spectrum, people who are working completely hand-in-hand with the government. Some of them might be National Guard soldiers or even national police officers who are not wearing uniforms, so they'll show up in civilian clothing, and they'll be collaborating closely with uniformed security officers to repress a protest. And there's pictures and videos of like National Guard soldiers in uniforms with people in civilian clothing sort of writing shotgun at protests, right? So you do see it the full spectrum. You see neighborhood groups that are unhappy with a protest happening in their neighborhood, and you see people who are really on the government payroll doing these activities at protests.
Right. And what is the situation with weapons, with, guns in Venezuela? To me, at least, it looked like it was only really the pro-government people that ended up getting their hands on, assault rifles and stuff like that. There were a few videos where you would see the youth, throwing their rocks, and then a guy would poke around the corner and, fire a shotgun, or I think there was even like an AK at one point, but I didn't see a lot of that. And I, honestly, in my ignorance, was surprised. I thought that would be able to rise quite quickly in Venezuela.
Yeah, one of the, the situation is so kind of dire and hopeless that it's hard to sometimes to see, okay, like what's one positive thing that's happened. I think one positive thing is that we haven't seen like full out civil conflict with, like roving gangs of opposition and Collectivo groups, with machine guns and like bazookas shooting at each other, right? I mean, that would be horrendous. I mean, the heavy weaponry for sure is on the side of the government, right? As it is anywhere. Not only, the state security forces count on the full arsenal of the government, of the National Bolivarian Armed Forces, and then some of that will filter down to Colectivo groups. So you do see pictures, you do see videos of Colectivo Armado groups with assault rifles. There's a video on YouTube where you can't see the weapon, but it sounds like a machine gun, like an FN mag. Shooting at a protest during a protest last year, and for the most part, as you see in footage from protests, as you see from media reports, opposition protesters don't have access to that weaponry, or if they do, they're not using it in any kind of significant way.
So there's just not that many weapons out on the streets, basically.
I would say that there are weapons out on the street, but they're not. I mean, people just aren't using them in protests. There's a couple of reasons for this. I mean, I think, generally, I think people don't want to get into gunfights.
Yeah, not a bad rule.
Yeah, I mean that's one of them. And the other thing is, this sort of gets at one of the talking points of the regime and its supporters when they're trying to paint the opposition as like this fascist sort of force that's out to like murder people on the streets who say that they support the government. The opposition protests are overwhelmingly peaceful. You can look up footage from the protests in 2017, 2014. You see masses of tens and tens of thousands of people marching peacefully, trying to exercise what rights they thought that they had. And the exercise of democratic rights is by definition a sort of a non-violent thing, right? So because the protest movement last year was based on like, let's assert our rights as citizens of a country that we think is democratic, that should be democratic. Let's do that peacefully, without weapons, because that's sort of the guiding principle, I think, of that struggle. And that's not to say that some protests, some opposition protests didn't turn violent eventually, but as they do anywhere else in the world, they tend to turn violent at precisely the moment that the police, that the National Guard, that the Collectivos show up and make them violent.
I remember seeing a lot of videos where there were, anti-government groups, and the kind of youth were trying to form kind of, I don't want to say militias, but, they were giving themselves names, and they were holding up, they were reading statements saying, this is who we are. It was kind of like the beginning of the Syrian civil war, just minus the assault rifles. But they were all carrying those little kind of mortar, those little mortars they make, those kind of welded tubes, and what do they fire out, rocks and stuff? Yeah,
or like fireworks. There's a video on YouTube of like, I think, I don't know what to call it. It was like a cannon, like a homemade cannon that shot fireworks. And it was like a really impressive sort of display of firework power, I guess. Yeah, there was some of that, definitely. And you also saw that on a bigger scale with people like Oscar Perez.
Yeah, I was going to say we should get into Oscar Perez. Like, who is Oscar Perez? Let's do that now.
So Oscar Perez was a police officer who tried to kickstart a general kind of insurrection against the government. He became a household name in June of last year when he hijacked a helicopter and he started to fly it around Caracas. And the media reports say that he was, shooting. It's not clear if it was grenades or flashbangs or some kind of explosive device at the Supreme Court building, but sort of in a clumsy way. Like, it didn't seem to be a really well kind of thought out plan. He was just flying this helicopter around. I think there was somebody else in the helicopter with him. He had a banner that was hanging out the helicopter that said Libertad and then the number 350. So the word Libertad means freedom or liberty. And 350 refers to an article of the Venezuelan Constitution that says that Venezuelans have a right to rebel against tyrannical government. So he was trying to tell people, that's in the Constitution for a reason. This is a tyrannical government. We need you to come out on the streets and kick these guys out. He was able to evade the authorities that day. He landed the helicopter in a wooded area north of Caracas, and he kind of went into hiding for a few months. He resurfaced in December of last year when he raided a National Guard's barrack near Caracas. There's a video of it. He recorded it and put it on YouTube. He stole a bunch of weapons, and he tied up all the soldiers that he found inside, and he gave them a lecture on civic duty and how to be better citizens and how to, he was sort of shaming them into, he was saying how dare you put on a uniform every day? You're supposed to be defending the people. You're working for the tyrants, that sort of stuff.
And he had a group at this point, right? It wasn't just him by this point. He had several other, former police officers. I think there was some military guys, no?
Yeah, that's right. So he ended up with a group called the Movimiento Equilibrium Nacional, the National Equilibrium Movement.
Really rolls off the tongue, that. It's perfect.
Yeah. To this day, I'm not sure that we know how big this group was. It was obviously quite small. I'm not sure that it's still operating today. He published a couple of videos even while he was in hiding throughout the second half of last year, doing what you mentioned earlier, sort of reading out statements with a background, with a Venezuelan flag and saying things like, we have to rebel.
And he had weapons as well, right? They all had, obviously, like you said, they raided the armed, the barracks. But in these videos, the difference I think with him was it wasn't kids on the street. This was a special police officer with other guys. They had body armor on, masks, assault rifles. It looked like this could be the start of something quite big.
Yeah, they were armed for sure. And they know how to use their weapons also because, as you said, they had the training. And Perez was actually a member of a special force within the police organization in which he served. And so when on January 15th of this year, when the authorities found him in a safe house near Caracas, there was a firefight. He posted a series of videos on Instagram the day that he was found out, saying, they've got us, they've surrounded us, we're trying to surrender. We don't want to fight these guys. We're completely surrounded. We want to get out of this house. But as the day progressed, he started posting videos in the middle of a firefight. So Perez claims that that his group, so he was in the house with 6 other people, 5 of whom were members of his group, and it looks like the 6th might not have been. It was a woman, and her family said afterwards that she wasn't a member of the Movimiento Equilibrium Nacional. She was the partner of one of the members, and she just happens to have been in the house when this raid took place. And so, they were armed. They were obviously capable of using their weapons.
I think we should mention as well, for any listeners, you need to watch this footage because it's insane. But you and me, we made this video, right? We made a video. I'll put a link at the end of this. We made a video kind of detailing it all. With Aliame Leroy at Bellingcat and BBC, and the footage is insane. This guy was a very charismatic guy. I believe he was an actual actor at one point. He was an action hero actor, and then he became a real action hero. And he's filming from inside this building gunfire coming from all directions. There's even footage with Perez bleeding out of his head, shouting like, we surrender, like, stop shooting, there are civilians in here. And then, as you found with the investigation, right, you believe they were executed, is that right?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, this was the piece that we wrote for Bellingcat with Alium Leroy. The evidence does seem to suggest that they were executed, and there's a couple of points to bring up in that sort of respect. Throughout the videos, especially in the early ones, Perez was very calm. He was very kind of unequivocal in stating, we're negotiating, we're trying to surrender. There's a couple of videos of him negotiating with the police outside. He's very cordial with them. The police are very cordial with him, and despite the fact that they were armed and that, they were police officers who were trained to use their weapons, his MO up to that point had not been to be violent, right? Even the raid on the barracks was sort of a weird moment because, as I mentioned earlier, nobody was hurt. He just tied people up and he told them to be better soldiers and to actually, do their jobs and that they should be ashamed of themselves, and then they left, right? So, It seems like from what we know from the evidence that was posted online that day, there was an honest effort by him to surrender. We also have intercepted radio communications that were posted online by Univision, demonstrating that the authorities understood that there was a surrender happening, that Perez was surrendering, that his intention was to surrender, even at the point when the officers were inside the house. So this is something that you can hear in the Univision leaked radio communications. The officers were in the house. They understood that the surrender was happening. And then suddenly, Perez is dead and his 6 companions were dead. All of them, with the exception of one, were shot in the head. Their autopsies, their death certificates show this. One of them was shot, I think, in the neck, and that's what killed them. But even after their deaths, the government was really kind of secretive about the whole thing. Their burials were highly regulated affairs. People weren't allowed to witness them for the most part. The house in which the raid took place was razed. So now it's not there anymore. It was just completely demolished by the government. And so all of the evidence that we looked through and considering the government's response after the fact suggests that they were executed.
The gunshot wounds to the head, the fact they all wanted to surrender. And then I'm not saying they hid evidence, but if you want to hide evidence, destroy the building's a pretty good way of going about it. You know what I mean?
That's how you would do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is from a state that is, brutally oppressing its people anyway. And the Collectivos were involved in this as well, right? I know there's footage of, a few Collectivos were killed by Perez and his men firing back and forth, right? And there's some pictures where they're kind of, having a full state funeral and that. What happened there?
Yeah, so that's one of the other interesting facets about this is that there were, as far as I can remember, 2 security officers who were killed in the firefight. When the government announced their deaths, they said that one of the officers who was killed was from the National Bolivarian Police, and that his name was Andrin Domingo Ugarte. So this is how it was announced to the public. Andrin was killed. He was a police officer. He was killed by Oscar Perez. We found out later that Andrin had another name, Hiker Vasquez, and that Hiker Vasquez was the head of a Collectivo in Caracas. So Hiker Vasquez and Andrin are the same person. Hiker Vasquez was both the member of a Collectivo and a National Bolivarian Police officer. And as you said, his funeral was attended by both members of a Collectivo Armado and uniformed members of the National Bolivarian Police. So that's a really, I think, good example of how kind of nebulous these groups are, right? You have, was he there in his capacity as a Collectivo member? Was he there in his capacity as a police officer? Is there a difference between the two in this case? Yeah. Is it an important difference, right? So it's a really kind of murky relationship that some Collectivos have with the government.
Yeah, I was going to say, it doesn't really matter if he was there as National Guard or a Collectivo if he's a member of both. You know what I mean? It's like the corruption has already happened there. It's a mad one. And what about this bomb? You know, there was it you that did an article on this, or was it Nick Waters? Bombs of Caracas.
So he wrote, Nick did all that. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, so there was a bomb. We'll get onto the drone thing later, but I want to talk about, you know, there was some footage, I think the tail end of the clashes in Caracas, and basically a bomb goes off in the street, right? Some National Guard are driving by. I don't think it killed anyone, but it's not a huge bomb, but it's a bomb nonetheless.
Yeah, we did see, I think there were two distinct ones that I remember, two separate events where, they were basically, I guess, what you would call an IED, right? It was an explosive device that was placed on the side of our road. Both times it happened in Caracas. At least the footage that I remember seeing was the two events happened in Caracas. It was towards the end of the protest wave, as you mentioned, and they both targeted. I'm not sure if they were National Guard or National Bolivarian Police, but they were state security forces. As you say, they were sort of driving by. Whoever was controlling the device waited for the officers to be nearby, and they detonated it. I don't know if we ever found out what kind of explosive it was. I'm sure somebody like Nick or somebody from Bellingcat would be able to, deconstruct the video and tell us from the smoke and the sound or whatever what kind of explosive it was. But as you say, I don't think anybody was killed. I'm not sure that nobody was injured, but nobody was killed in those explosions.
And who do you think that was? I mean, there's clearly at least one person, took it to the extreme and actually built an IED for it. I
mean, depending on what kind of explosive it was, it could have been anybody. It could have been, one of those kids that you say, posted those videos on Instagram or YouTube saying, me and my 4 buddies here are part of X whatever group and we're rebelling against the government, right? If it was fireworks, it could have been anybody that has access to fireworks, right? The protest did really kind of seem to be spiraling out of control into uncharted territory with Perez, with his intervention into the national scene and with these IEDs. But for whatever reason, we didn't see too many of them. As I said, I think there was just the 2 that I can remember in Caracas.
And with Perez, I mean, what kind of support did he have? Because I know he didn't really have. He wasn't really like, we're leading the revolution. He was trying to basically create the spark that started that wave.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. What's one of the things that's really interesting about him is that I remember following the developments on the day that he hijacked the helicopter, and I think maybe the most common reaction that I saw from people was that this wasn't a real thing. Like, he was a government plant, or he wasn't really serious about this, and there was a lot of skepticism, even from opposition groups, and I would say even from some of the more kind of gung-ho ones, right? Saying, let's wait to see what happens. We're not gonna, let's not go out on the streets as he's asking us to do right now, because we don't know who this guy is. As the days passed and we found out more about him, it almost seemed as if that feeling became more widespread, because we found out, as you mentioned, that he had been in a movie, and his Instagram account was full of sort of, I don't want to say bizarre, but a little bit bizarre videos of him like doing trick shots with his pistol, and there was one of him like jumping out of a helicopter with a dog.
He's a real narcissist, basically.
Yeah, he was sort of a really kind of odd character, and he had the social media presence to prove it. And so I think at first people were really hesitant, and they really asked themselves, "Is this, who is this guy really? What is all this about?" As time went on, I think he won over many more followers. I think the National Guard barracks raid kind of cemented the idea in a lot of people's heads, if you were skeptical that he was the real deal, because that was beyond him posting a video on YouTube telling people to go out on the streets, right? Like, it was clear by that point that he was willing to act.
Yeah, I remember even you and me like talking, and I was like, this guy has got to be, he's the government, right? They just sent in a decoy, and even we were like, maybe, you know what I mean, for a while.
It was tough. Yeah, it was tough at first. I remember even some high-profile political opposition leaders saying, like, no, we're not gonna, we have nothing to do with this. We don't know what this is about. This isn't us. Please don't, But I think, yeah, as I said, as time went on, I think it became clear to people that he was honest in his desire to, as you say, spark a rebellion. Maybe not lead it himself, but to inspire people to take direct action and fight for a different government.
Right, and I think it's safe to say now that we could call it maybe an uprising of sorts, but the uprising or rebellion or whatever has been crushed now. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, one of the things that the Maduro regime has been able to do really well is crush dissent through a variety of means. The massive protests are crushed, or have been crushed, or were crushed by sort of the brutal repression that we saw. That might be tantamount to crimes against humanity. Actually, there's the International Criminal Court is investigating the regime's conduct during the protest last year, precisely looking for that answer. What were crimes against humanity committed in the repression of protests?
And what kind of crimes were committed? What were they doing to protesters?
So beyond shooting unarmed protesters without any regard for their well-being, there are widespread allegations. Really substantiated allegations of torture happening to people who were detained over, we were talking about thousands of arbitrary detentions, people getting picked up just for being near a protest for absolutely no reason, being imprisoned for that. And so those are the two, I think, that the ICC and international organizations are looking at: torture, the indiscriminate use of force against unarmed protesters, and arbitrary detentions. Beyond that, the regime has also been really good at neutralizing the political opposition. One of the things that I hear sometimes from people is they'll say things like, well, of course, Maduro has everyone supporting Venezuela because there's no opposition. The opposition is so ineffective. Well, Maduro doesn't have a lot of support in Venezuela, but to the extent that people don't support the opposition, a large part of that, I would say, is because the regime has been so successful at completely destroying it. So, they've imprisoned opposition leaders. There are opposition leaders in prison today on completely made up charges. Others have been driven out of the country into exile because they were persecuted. They were threatened. They had their families threatened. They were threatened with arrest.
It's like the Turkey playbook, basically. Like, what they did with HDP, put the leader in prison, and then anybody that's kind of talking out or, doesn't fall in line, again, prison. It's just that, right?
Exactly, yeah. It's a way to in effect, I think, create an opposition that is sort of like the sanctioned opposition, right? So anybody who isn't in jail, I think, is not in jail because the government doesn't feel like they need to put you in jail yet. But if you speak out, if you start sort of gaining followers, if you seem like you might eventually become a bit of a thorn at their side, you get the weight of the state thrown at you, right? And the other things that have happened are the regime has also, because it controls the Supreme Court and the National Electoral Council, these are the people who run the elections, they've closed off all of the avenues really that a political opposition could use to replace them. So this is why we're seeing electoral fraud happening. Any action that the National Assembly does, again, the National Assembly is controlled by the opposition. Any bill that they pass, any law that they pass is immediately ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So yeah, the rebellion, if you want to call it that, has been crushed, I think, for now, both through the kind of brutal repression that you see on the streets and also through more institutional and legal means.
Yeah, well, with that in mind, I just said, well, looks like he's crushed the rebellion that was happening. However, there was the drone attack recently. So there's definitely some people, maybe only a few, who still have plans to do something to Maduro. So for any listeners that don't know, basically a IED mounted on a drone exploded near Maduro recently at a kind of military parade type thing. Maybe you can tell us about that, because there's a lot of speculation about who set the drone off, what actually happened. What do you think?
Yeah, so the thing about those sort of events is that we really don't have anything to go by except for what people record and put on Twitter and what the government says. So the government's version of events in this case, as is often the case, is that the drone was sort of put in the air by this kind of nebulous coalition of enemies, foreign and domestic, like Colombia, the United States, expats, political opposition leaders, etc. Right? I don't know how much of that we can go by. They have arrested, the last time I checked, over a dozen people. Some of them were active members of the military. And so it is, I think, evident that there are, I would say, individual cells of dissenters that are still trying to kickstart something. But the problem for them is that, for the most part, they're just sad. They're individual cells, right? There's been something like 40 army officers arrested since the start of the year on charges that they were involved in a plot to overthrow Maduro, right? So we do get hints occasionally that something might be happening beneath the surface, but the hints that we get are that it's not sort of widespread. That we're not talking about entire sort of like regiments taking up arms against the government. These are, for the most part, they appear to be relatively small groups with very limited means, very limited support, who are not able to really act in a concerted effort.
Yeah, and also I think when, if they say, there was this many military officers plotting against Maduro because of the arbitrary arrests and, the kind of totalitarian vibes of the regime right now, it could have been anything. You know what I mean? It's like, like in Turkey, you step out of line, terrorism, 100 years dungeon. It doesn't really mean much. But, like a bomb did go off, a bomb went off, right? And it seemed to be some way quite well planned. The fact it went off quite near him. I read an article that said there was some military guys in Colombia had been planning it. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I think the government connected it to a military training camp in Colombia. So they said that the drone operators practiced flying the drone, I think is what the government claimed, in a camp in Colombia, and they gave it a name. I can't remember it right now. But as you say, I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if we can be sure that it's true, because that's the government's go-to line for anything that happens, right? Like the Maduro regime blames Colombia for the scarcity in Venezuela.
Why Colombia? Because of the relationship with America?
Yeah, yes, that's part of it. And the other thing is that as Venezuela's neighbor, and in particular since the election that they had in Colombia recently, Venezuela sort of needs a scapegoat, right? Like Maduro can't say that he's responsible for what's happening in the country, right? So he looks around and he blames virtually everybody that is around him, and that includes Colombia. There is one phenomenon that does impact Venezuela, and in particular the border regions, is the selling of Venezuelan gasoline in Colombia, because gas in Venezuela is the cheapest on the planet. It costs like fractions of a cent to fill up your car. What people do is that they'll get a whole sort of truck full of gas, and they'll take it from Venezuela to Colombia, and they'll sell it in Colombia at the Colombian price, and you make all kinds of profit, right? So Maduro says, well, Colombia is doing this, right? Well, no, Colombia just happens to be there, but what's doing this is this sort of gas subsidy that has been in place forever, and the people who are smuggling the gas, they tend to be either connected to the army or the army itself, right? The Venezuelan army. So it's not necessarily Colombia that's orchestrating this. It's corruption in the regime and mismanagement that is fueling this entire industry.
Yeah, and before we wrap this up, maybe you can give us an idea of what life is like right now in Venezuela, because I know you have relatives and what have you, and you know a lot about the kind of current situation for people there. What are they living under?
Yeah, well, things are really rough. The inflation rate is expected to hit a million percent by the end of the year.
1,000,000%.
A million, yeah, 1 million. So that's the one with the 6 zeros. By the end of the year, it'll be the highest on the planet. So what that means is that, you go to a supermarket today and, you might come back later the same day or the next day and the same item that you looked at yesterday is now more expensive, if you can find it. Power outages are a fact of life. So reliable access to electricity is becoming, it's not something that you can count on anymore. That's especially true anywhere except Caracas, although Caracas is getting hit by it as well. Medicine is scarce. I can't tell you how many messages I see on Twitter every single day from people literally going on Twitter and saying, hey, I have diabetes, I need insulin. If you've got any, hit me up, posting their phone numbers. Diseases that were once eradicated are coming back. There are people who, and I'm talking about thousands of people who don't have access to chemotherapy drugs. If you've got cancer, good luck. There was a report released, it was presented before the United Nations Human Rights Council earlier this month that said that Venezuelans lost an average of 11 kilograms last year due to the food shortages. So it's a dire situation. As you say, I do have family there, and one of my daily concerns is them.
And what do you think is going to happen in the future? This can't be sustained for much longer, surely.
I've said that, I've been saying that, and people have been saying that since 15 years ago. If I've learned anything from covering Venezuela, it's that things are bad today, and they can get worse, because that's what's been happening for so long. I think, as I said earlier, I think the regime has done a good job and I'm not saying that they should have done this. I'm saying that they've succeeded at cementing their hold on power. So I think that they've successfully, at least for now, sort of knocked the wind out of any kind of effort to have Maduro removed from power. This is one of the migrant crisis now that we're living through. Something like 2.3 million people have left the country in the last couple of years. That's about 7% of the population, and I think that's a sign that people have made a choice. I think whereas before, a lot of Venezuelans were saying, let's stay and fight because we can beat this and we can get through this. I think the migrant crisis is a sign that people might be saying, it's let's not, we tried and it didn't work.
Let's get out.
Let's just leave, yeah. And you can't blame them, right? I think any change, even something that was true a couple of years ago, the possibility of a negotiated transition out of power, right? I think that's not likely anymore. I think any election that we have in Venezuela going forward under Maduro is going to be rigged, as the previous couple ones have been. So the electoral path is out. Maduro, I don't think, is going to suddenly resign. I think any change in leadership at the presidency is going to be either from the military, which I don't see happening, or the party itself, like the PSUV, if things get really bad, might do they might change pictures and they might put somebody else in power, but that's still going to be a PSUV president. So it's, I hate to be gloomy, but I think it's a gloomy situation.
No, exactly. It doesn't look very good. One last thing, America must be kind of rubbing their hands together right now. They must have a close eye on things.
Yeah, there was a report. I forget who published it. It might have been the Washington Post or anyways, there was a news article that came out relatively recently that said that a U.S. government representative had been invited to participate in talks that were happening in Venezuela about a coup. So there was a group of army officers and maybe I can't remember who were meeting, and they were like, okay, let's we're gonna overthrow Maduro. Let's invite the U.S. representative to come. The U.S., from what I understand, sent a representative under instructions that they don't promise any help. They were just there to observe, is what the article says. And again, the article mentions that, I wish I had it in front of me, but if you look it up, the U.S. representative, I think, was surprised that there wasn't a plan. Like the people who were plotting the coup didn't really have a plan. They had invited the U.S. representative so that they would tell them what to do, or that he would pledge support, right? So yeah, the U.S. is the U.S. is the U.S., right? I mean, you don't have to look very far in history to see that it's interested in getting its hands on all sorts of in all sorts of places, right? Under Obama, I don't know, and I'm not a huge Obama fan. I would have, when people are saying under Obama, oh, the U.S. is about to invade Venezuela, I would say, no, that's not going to happen. Like Obama, that wouldn't happen. Under Trump, I have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, I would not be shocked to hear that the U.S. has invaded Venezuela because Trump decided, he woke up that day and he sort of said, okay, let's do it. I don't know. The U.S. always has had an interest in the region. It's going to continue to have an interest in the region. How that manifests, in the Trump presidency, I can't even imagine.
Yeah. My granddad was saying, like, the only good thing about Trump is that he's so crackers that he actually puts a lot of these totalitarian dictators on edge. Because if Obama says, like, we'll go in, they're just like, shut up, Obama. But if Trump says it, they're like, this guy might be mad enough to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, Maduro wasn't going to go to the UN General Assembly, that was last week or 2 weeks ago. He said, I'm probably not going to go. I don't think so. And then Trump said, well, if he comes, I'll probably talk to him, maybe. And Maduro immediately jumped on a plane and said, okay, I've changed my mind. I'm actually going to go. And, was supposedly hoping that he would get a chance to sit down with Trump and work something out. And then Trump sort of decided that he didn't want to talk to him anyways. So, yeah, I think, not to change this into like the Trump podcast, he's a horrible human being in every sense of the word. So I don't want to say that it's good about Trump that he does this, but I think he is so unstable that you can't help but take him seriously in a certain way.
Well, yeah, this is the problem with, I'm not going to turn this into politics, but this is the problem with political discourse now. Unfortunately, to even talk about Trump, you have to give this disclaimer of, I don't like, and I don't like him. The thing with the ICE situation where the kids being put in fucking concentration camps. However, like we said, on the world stage, it is very different. I guess lastly, what are your hopes for Venezuela? What do you want to happen, in a realistic manner?
I think in a realistic manner, yeah. If you'd asked me a year ago, I said, let's have an election. Let's have a sort of a free and fair election with lots of international observers from organizations that observe elections. Let's have a vote, and see, let us choose who we want to lead us. If a dialogue process, mediated by the international community could result in that, I think that would be good. If and only if the elections were truly free and fair. I think, Maduro needs to go. I think the PSUV, the ruling party, needs to go. I want that to be peacefully. I want them to go peacefully. If Maduro were to say, you know what, I'm done, I'm going to take all my money and I'm going to go to Cuba and live the rest of my life, I'd be happy with that. If it meant that the country could rebuild. The one kind of shining light, I think, is the fact that Venezuelan people, I think, generally really love their country and they want it to succeed. And with so many Venezuelans having left, I want to believe that when the time comes to rebuild the country, a lot of us will help do that. That's what I'd like to see.
Okay, well, yeah, me as well. I hope it all works out, man. Like you said, it's your country, and it's a beautiful country from what I've seen. It's a real shame.
Yeah, thank you.
And where can people get hold of you, mate? Where can they, follow your work, keep in touch with you, ask any questions?
Yeah. So I'm at the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. I also run a website. It's www.in-venezuela.com, and I have a Twitter account as well, where I post daily updates on the crisis in Venezuela. So you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on my website, you can find me on, if you're in Toronto, at the Centre for Criminology.
What is the Twitter address as well, so people can, get hold?
It's at In Venezuela Blog.
Excellent. Okay, mate, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jake.
That was Giancarlo Fiorella talking about the crushed rebellion in Venezuela and the rapidly deteriorating situation in the country. As mentioned in the episode, there is a video about Oscar Perez's last hours that I made with Giancarlo and Alium Leroy. You can find that at youtube.com/popularfront. Look for Oscar Perez's last hours. It lays it all out. As usual, this episode was sponsored by thedefensepost.com. That's defense with an S. I was on the website this morning, actually. There's loads of new stuff on there, so do check them out. And if you want to support Popular Front, if you want to keep this going and in return get bonus episodes, narrated articles, all sorts of other stuff, please do support us on patreon.com/popularfront. Right now things are growing at a really good pace. Thank you very much to the $30 Patreons. They are Alium Leroy, Axel Iverson, Cedar Fenn, Chad Walker, Cody Bergerud, Dan, Diana Gorvanek, Dan Dunham, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, James, Joanne Stocker, Lawrence Abrams, LH, Margaret Bowling, Peter McCormack, Ryan Sandercock, Stephen Henderson, Teddy and Zachary Hinch. So like I said, if you want to support, go to patreon.com/popularfront. It's much appreciated. And by the way, if I've said any of your names wrong, please get in touch and tell me. I'm really bad with names, so apologies. To keep up to date with all things Popular Front, follow me on Twitter. That's Jake_Hanrahan. HANRAHAN is how you spell my surname. Or if you can't be bothered with me, follow at Popular Front CO, which is the same as the website. The website is popularfront.co. When the Patreon hits a certain goal, I will be turning that landing page into a full-blown website. There will be articles, videos, all the podcast stuff will be there, a shop, all sorts. It's going to be really good. Follow us on Instagram. We've got loads of stuff going on there. It's instagram.com/popular.front. And there will be something new coming to the YouTube soon, so go to youtube.com/popularfront. Please do subscribe and hit the bell, because like I've said before, YouTube is a terrible platform. It doesn't work properly, so you have to hit the bell to make sure you get updates on the videos. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro was by Son of Old. He's got new music on his SoundCloud, so go to soundcloud.com/son-of-old.